Okay, so let's go over some examples of identifying the sampling method. In example 1, it says an online news site asks readers to take a brief survey about whether they subscribe to a daily newspaper. In this example, this would be an example of a self-selected sample. And the reason is because the news site just asked readers to take the survey. So anybody who wants to take the survey can take the survey, and that's why it is self-selected. Now, could there be any potential bias? For this example, there could be some bias because you are asking visitors of a news site if they subscribe to a daily newspaper. So you already know that they tend to be interested in the news since they're on a news website. And so there could be some bias because they already have interest in the news. In example 2, it says a survey of a city's residents is conducted by asking 20 people at a grocery store whether the city should impose a beverage tax. This is an example of a convenience sample. The reason that this is convenience is because there's no effort put into it to make it a random sample. Somebody just went to the grocery store and they asked 20 people at the grocery store, and it doesn't really go into an intentional way of randomizing the sample. And so therefore this would be considered convenience. Could there be potential bias for this? Well, there could be. You're only going to one grocery store, so it depends on the neighborhood that you might be in at the grocery store. And you're talking to people who buy groceries. And so the tax is a beverage tax. So they might have more of an opinion than somebody who doesn't buy groceries, or a different opinion from somebody who goes to a specific beverage store versus a grocery store. So bias based on, maybe we could say based on location, because we're only going to one grocery store out of the whole city. And you could also have bias because they are shopping and could be buying beverages, so they might have a strong opinion. In example 3 here, it says a survey of students at a school is conducted by asking 30 students randomly selected through a lottery system in an all-school assembly whether they walk, drive, or take the bus to school. In this example, this is an example of a simple random sample. And the reason is because they purposefully chose 30 students at random using a lottery system. So they put a lot of effort into making sure that it was a random survey. And in this one, could there potentially be bias? There could be, but this one doesn't have too much bias in it, and that tends to be the case of a simple random sample, because I'm randomly asking 30 kids at the school, and all of them got to school somehow, so they must have either walked, driven, or taken the bus. So this one is a pretty good survey, not a lot of bias in this one. Example 4, Miss Foy wants to know the percentage of juniors that will take 2 math classes their senior year. She asks the first 30 juniors she saw throughout the day. This would be an example of a convenience sample. And the reason is because she just asked the first 30 people that she saw. That was very easy. There wasn't a lot of effort put in to make sure she really got a random sampling of the juniors. Now, in this one, we also want to identify the population and the sample. So let's think about that. For this one, the population that we want to look at is the entire junior class, because we only want to know the percentage of juniors that will take 2 math classes their senior year. So we're really specifically looking at a population of just junior students. And then the sample is the 30 juniors that Miss Foy sees throughout the day. In this one, is there possible bias? There is. Well, a lot of times with convenience, there's bias. For example, the first 30 juniors that Miss Foy might see might all be in her class. And so that could have a bias because they're all currently in the same math class right now. Another bias that there might be is the fact that Miss Foy is a math teacher. So maybe some people feel like they want to impress the math teacher or want to give a different answer because they're talking to a math teacher. So there could be some bias there as well. I'm going to stick with the one that these students, just because Miss Foy teaches math. So the first 30 that she sees might be in her math class, and then also they might know that she teaches math and so might want to give a different answer. In the next example, it says Miss Eckstein wants to know the percentage of juniors that will take 2 math classes their senior year. So the same type of example, let's see how she samples. She asks students in her class to place their response on a sticky note if they want to share their opinion. Again, this can be considered a convenience sample, just like before, because Ms. Eckstein is not going outside of her own class. She is just focused on the students in her class when her population is the whole junior class. But this one is also a self-selected. And the reason that this is self-selected is because she asks them to place the sticky note if they want to share. So they don't have to share their opinion. Is there bias here? Yes, there could be. Some students might be shy to share their plans, right? If you maybe we're taking multiple math classes. Maybe you feel excited about it, but you don't want other people to know. And so you might not choose to share your response just because you don't want people to know that. And so when you have a self-selected survey, that's one bias that could show up. In example 6, Miss George wants to know the percentage of juniors that will take 2 math classes their senior year. She asks Miss Kelly to print out a list of all the juniors and picks every 10th student on the list. This right here is the rule of a systematic sampling. So in systematic, you sample based on a rule. My rule would be every 10th student. Now, systematic sampling tends to be a pretty good sampling method because you do get a fairly random sample when you do this. Could there still be bias? Possibly. Maybe there's just bias because Miss George is a math teacher, and so people might give a different response to a math teacher. But for the most part, this is a pretty good one. In the previous 2 examples, especially in example 5, Miss Eckstein also had a relationship with the students because they were her students. That could also cause a bias. Whereas not every student, every 10th student on the list might know Miss George, and so they might feel more comfortable to just give their answer and walk away. So still potential bias there, but the random sampling does help a lot. Again, in Miss Eckstein's class too, we didn't really mention this, and I had mentioned it for Miss Foy, but again, those are all juniors that are already in the same math class. And so that also creates a bias too, is because they are already in the same class. So the likelihood of them taking the same classes next year is higher, versus when Miss George does a systematic sampling method, she's choosing students from all over the school, not just in one math class. And so it's more likely that their answers will vary. In example 7, Mr. Nicholson wants to know student opinions regarding current cell phone policies. He randomly selects 6 classrooms and asks all students in those classes to share their opinion. This is an example of a cluster sample. What Mr. Nicholson does is he first breaks them into groups, the groups being the classrooms. And then he takes all students in some groups. So he selects certain groups and then he takes all of the students in those classes. And so that is a cluster. In this example, there could potentially be bias. Maybe there's some bias based on which classes are picked. If I sample all of the students that are in the same class, it's possible their teacher doesn't really enforce the cell phone policy. So all of their opinions might be the same because the policy doesn't seem to affect them. Whereas in other classes, some teachers might be a little bit stricter and the cell phone policy has more of an impact on those students. So maybe bias based on class. In example 8, it says, Dr. Long wants to know student opinions regarding current cell phone policies. He randomly selects 100 students from each grade level and surveys those students regarding their opinion. This is an example of a stratified sample. Again, Dr. Long is going to start by breaking up groups, and he does so based on grade level. But what he does next is he takes some from each group. So he will take a few from every single group. In this example, is there potential bias? There could be. There could be some bias because Dr. Long is the principal. And so some people might be nervous to share their true opinions with him because he is in charge of the school. And so maybe there's some bias because of Dr. Long's position. And while you may want to complain to your friends, it's a lot different when you have to complain to the principal himself. But this one is a pretty good sampling method because you're getting a few kids from each grade. And so you're sure that you're getting some representation all across the board. Whereas if you don't do a stratified sample, sometimes you don't.